Welcome to Stand to Reason's Facebook Live today. I'm here with my good buddy and young gun.
I think you're going to say young Guppy.
Yeah, the young Guppy. So I wasn't going to say Guppy. I was going to spare you that for this time. But anyway, Mr. Tim Barnett, down from Ontario here in the Stand to Reason offices, and we're glad to have him visit once in a while. We can see his beautiful face and mix it up with him. And actually, we're going to talk today about something that is really important, and I think it plagues a lot of Christians when they're out there engaging with others about spiritual matters. It has to do with a foundational source of information, the Bible, specifically Bible contradictions, and the charge that the Bible is full of contradictions. And of course, the thrust there is to get people who can't answer such a charge, or maybe the specific contradictions or things that are offered as contradictions. It's to get them to mistrust the Bible.
Yeah.
We place all of our confidence in the Bible, and if the Bible can't be trusted, then our faith is not well grounded. And this kind of approach really shakes a lot of people up. So what we're going to do here as we start out, we're going to deal with, Tim has written a whole piece about this. Is this on the website, Tim? Is it?
There's a video and there's a couple different articles that I've written.
Okay, so if you go to str.org, you'll be able to find some more pieces to this. If this piques your curiosity, and we hope that it does, then you can get more detail. But what we want to do is we want to try to start out by putting the issue of Bible contradictions in perspective, okay? And the first thing we'll chat about just a little bit is, if it were true, what does it prove? And then we want to talk about some principles that, and frankly, even before we get to the nuts and bolts of specific contradictions, I think if you get these principles, these foundational things, this is going to help you deal with a lot of things that we're not able to talk about here, okay? When we talk about the details, we're just going to be able to, the particular verses, we're going to be showing you how some of these principles actually work out in practice in particular instances. So that's the most important thing. And here's the first thing that I think we would like you to understand. If somebody says the Bible is filled with contradictions, what if I were to ask them, kind of Columbo style, if that were true? Now, we don't think it's true, but if it were true, what would that prove? Now, that's a Columbo question, okay? It tosses the ball back into their court, and what it's meant to do is to show people the significance, or what I think even the lack of significance of this charge to our wider project. Because I want to hear what they're going to say. Even if their claim that there are contradictions goes through, what does that prove? Okay? And we're here to say it doesn't prove much.
No, we think
that's your cue.
Okay, that's my cue to jump in?
Yeah, that's your cue to jump in.
I mean, I'm just loving sitting next to you and listening to you teach. I want to be on that side of the camera. We don't think much follows from it. And what we believe, of course, we hold to inerrancy.
Certainly.
We hold the Bible is without error. All that this
hear that, by the way, we believe in inerrancy. Okay, that's not on the table.
Absolutely.
We're
but
with
this
most
is
of you on that.
But
Go
this
ahead.
was it's an in-house discussion between Christians.
Right.
What this challenge sets out is the challenge is the Bible full of contradictions. They want to say yes, it is. So what follows from that? Well, maybe the Bible's not inerrant. It follows from that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean Christianity is not true. It doesn't mean that Jesus didn't die and rise from the dead. No, that doesn't follow. And so I think what we need to do is we need to put this challenge in its proper place.
Yes, exactly. That's what we're doing now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sometimes have people say, well, the Bible's only written by men, and men make mistakes.
Yeah.
And my next question is, do you have any books in your library? Right? Of course
Sure.
you do. Who wrote that? Aliens? God? No.
Yeah.
We have books that we use all the time that we acknowledge may be, fall short of complete perfection. But we don't throw them in the dustbin. We realize that even books that might have liabilities things that don't look right, they still could be magnificent sources of true information theologically, in the case of the Bible, or historically, in the case of the accounts of Jesus of Nazareth. So just to underscore this first point, that is, this is a charge meant to, the only thing that it's capable of doing is to show that the Bible isn't inerrant. Okay, it has some contradictions, if we were to admit that. It just shows that it's inerrant. It doesn't show that, taken as a whole, it's a picture of reality. It's an account of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. It's depiction of salvation. All of those things, it doesn't show that any of those things are false. So in a certain sense, and like Tim said, this is an in-house discussion. I don't discuss inerrancy with non-Christians. I don't expect them to believe it's inerrant. I just want them to go to the Bible as a source of historical information about the life of Jesus and reflections of a theological nature that when I read it, I think they make a lot of good common sense. And I don't have to make the case of inerrancy in order to make the case for Christianity or the case for God or even the case for the significance of the Bible to tell us important things about theological matters. So there's a certain, what we're trying to do is a little bit take some of the gravity out of this challenge to show it, even if they succeed in showing some contradictions, it doesn't prove too much for the skeptic or for the atheist. In fact, it proves almost nothing significant, okay? But we think we can do a lot better than that. Sure. I just want to lay that out as the first thing. Here's another important principle, and I want Tim to respond to this a little bit. And this is that it's always a good habit to read a person's writings charitably. And that is that we don't just presume that the person writing is an idiot and that he's going to say one thing on one page and the next page he's going to say something the opposite. I think the charitable approach, and we should do this even with people we disagree with. We're not going to try to misread or try to read in problems that really may not be there. It's to try to find a way to harmonize what a person says, because in all of our conversation, if someone were to isolate individual phrases, they could construe a contradiction when in fact there's no contradiction at all.
Yeah, so I think what we need to do is try to find out what the author actually intended in what they're writing. Right. And I think most of the Bible contradictions that we'll look at, the ones that come up, have to do with the reader kind of imposing or forcing a certain reading onto the text. Whereas we should charitably, as you said, read the context, read what the author said in their writings, read as charitably as we can, not assuming these guys didn't know what they were doing. Yeah.
So this is this has to do again what you bring to the text and acknowledging that when people talk and when they write, even in our culture, and the culture where the text of the scripture was written was different in some ways that we have to make latitude for if we understand how they wrote. But even in our culture, we generalize about things, Sure. We sum things up and and I told him this, and the next time we recite the same account, well, I told him this, and it'll be a little bit different words, even though the gist is the same, because we don't mean to be, like one person put it, it's not Memorex. And probably 90% of our audience don't know what that means, but there used to be a audio tape called Memorex that really gave perfect rendition of what people said. But that's not what the text is meant to do.
I think what ends up happening is we treat this first century document like it's a 21st century document. Like we've got our HD video camera out and we're recording these events. When it wasn't, we need to look at these documents as what they are. In the case of the Gospels, these are Greco-Roman biography style, right? And so let's read them as they would have written in that first century, not how I'm writing a news report in the 21st century. There's going to be different things different styles, different techniques in our writing.
Or ways that we approach things and precision that we look for now that they didn't have then.
And just when I give this presentation on Is the Bible Full of Contradictions, I often tell a story. It's made up, but I imagine, my wife telling me when I get home, she says, there was a knock at the door around lunchtime, answered the door, and it was Publishers Sweepstakes with $1 million check. Mm-hmm. And I was so excited. And then later on, she tells the same story to her mom. But she says, it was 12:05 and the doorbell rang. And it woke up the baby. I had to go get the baby, brought her down, and I came to the door, and there was this guy with a Publishers Clearinghouse check for $1 million. With a guy recording the whole thing. When we look at these two stories,
that was the guy's version versus the
that was the guy's version versus the girl's version. I keep it simple for me. That's all. I just want the general details.
Right.
It would be inappropriate for me to turn to my wife and say, you know what, you are a stinking liar. Look at all the ways you contradicted yourself.
Right.
You didn't tell me there was two people. There was just one.
Yeah.
No, this is how we communicate all the time.
Right.
We grant that kind of charity, and you can't give all the details. We all have to select what we're going to record. In the case of the Gospels, they had to do just that. They only had so much room to write, and they had a certain purpose. And so John is going to write the things that John thinks are important, and Matthew's going to do the same.
When we try to import a 20th or 21st century now notion onto that first century style, this is a kind of anachronism. We are distorting. And a classic one that I'd heard once is someone was complaining because they read the text that said they went from Samaria up to Jerusalem. And they said, look at a map, Samaria's north of Jerusalem. You don't go up to Jerusalem, you go down to Jerusalem. Well, of course, they're importing their modern understanding of cartography and how maps work. These guys didn't have maps, they had geography. And no matter what side you're approaching Jerusalem from, you're going up because it's a higher elevation. When you realize that, you think, oh man, silly me. But that kind of error actually happens quite a bit.
Sure.
When we are importing something from the present into the past and then creating an apparent contradiction or textual problem that isn't really there. So the first thing we've said is, listen, what's riding on this? Well, not a whole lot, it turns out, even if there are contradictions. Secondly, we said, hey, let's try to read authors charitably and look for ways to find a reconciliation if it can be made. And strictly speaking, and you mentioned when we were talking earlier about John A.T. Robinson, who is this guy's not a liberal, a conservative theologian at all, but he says, he made an observation. If you can find a possible way of reconciling it, well, that's all that's necessary to defeat the charge of contradiction. Mm-hmm. Because contradiction is a very precise kind of thing. Maybe I'm stepping on your lines here, because you might be getting to it in just a minute.
No,
but it's a very precise kind of thing where, and I'm the boss, right? So I can just step on you. It's a very precise kind of claim where both things cannot be true at the same time, okay? And many times what is being voiced turns out not to be a contradiction, but maybe only a partial explanation where some other details, as you suggested in your illustration a moment ago, could be true with it.
So there might be a difference. And so tactically speaking, when someone raises contradictions, your first Columbo question is going to be, well, what do you mean by a contradiction? Yeah. Because that, like you just said, is something very specific. They might just mean, well, there's differences within the Gospels. And we're willing to grant, that's true. There are differences. The author's told from different perspectives and different directions. And so a difference, if we're going to be technical here, a difference is possible to reconcile. A contradiction, we would say, isn't possible.
A genuine contradiction.
That's right. And so our argument, our belief is that the Bible actually isn't full of contradictions. There are no contradictions. That is, things that can't be reconciled. We would grant wholeheartedly that there are differences, and some of them are actually hard to deal with.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean there isn't an explanation.
Right. Here's another principle that I like to use, and when somebody raises challenges to Christianity, here's my rule. And it might sound harsh at first, but let me explain it. I say if you don't understand our view, you can't criticize it, okay? If you don't understand our view, you can't criticize it. Now, this goes to an informal fallacy called a straw man, where people maybe inadvertently misrepresent another view. They erect not the real thing, but a straw man version, like a scarecrow, which you can knock over real easily. It's easy to defeat the distortion, but you got to really deal with the real thing. And to me, a great example of that is when people raise the issue of homosexuality and the Bible, and someone cites the book of Leviticus that identifies homosexuality as a terrible wrong, punishable by death, and then they say, well, look, we're not killing people for disobeying their parents now, we're not killing people for violating the Sabbath, and this was all part of the Mosaic law, so how could you possibly hold from Leviticus that homosexuality is wrong? Now, this is an example of somebody raising a criticism and not understanding our view. In some ways, I don't blame them on this, because there's a lot of Christians who don't understand this either. But keep in mind, there is a New Testament and there is an Old Testament. Okay, the New Testament is new, the Old Testament is old. Point being that there was a way in which God dealt with his people under the theocracy of the Old Covenant that is different than the way he deals with people under the New Covenant. The things that were wrong under the Old Covenant are still wrong, which is our point of citing Leviticus and homosexuality. We know they're still wrong because it comes up in the New Testament. But the punishments and the penalties for them are different because we're not living in a theocracy. We are living in a whole different set of circumstances. So those details, of course, are not going to apply. So some of the challenges that get raised towards Christianity are things that are just raised in virtue of a lack of understanding of how our program or our theological project works. And there are a lot of Christians who don't understand that those things themselves. Now, here's another point. There are certain passages that seem to directly contradict, and there is not an easy solution. The solution comes through closer analysis, harder study, closer look at the culture and stuff like that. Some things we can resolve fairly quickly. Other things it takes a while to resolve when we look more deeply at it. But even in those cases, those things can be resolved. I'm thinking right now of the objection that some people point out about the conflict between Paul in Romans 4 and James in chapter 2 of that book that has to do with the issue of justification.
That's right.
And I know you have some things to say about it, so do I. Why don't you go first?
Sure. It seems to me that Paul and James are talking, they're using the same word, justification.
Well, identify the problem.
So the problem is that Paul argues for justification by faith. Alone. And so there's no works there. But when you go to James, it seems to indicate that it's the exact opposite. That you're justified by your works.
Yeah. Paul says that for him who does not work but believes in a God who justifies the ungodly, to him it's reckoned as righteousness. And then in James he says, no, you are not justified by faith alone.
That's right.
And then he gives examples. Ironically, he gives the same example in James 2 to show justification by works as Paul gives, or he goes back to the same
guy,
same person as Paul
right.
gives in Romans chapter 4. Abraham in both cases.
That's right. But what's going on there is James is pointing to a particular event where Abraham is justified in the sense that he's just as I would say as a teacher, student, justify your work, show the evidence of your work. And that's exactly what Abraham does in Genesis 22.
Yeah, I think that's
right.
Right. With sacrificing Isaac. And that's what James refers to.
But Paul's referring to something that happened
20 years.
Decades earlier, where he was actually justified by his faith. He believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And so these are the same terms being used, but they're being used in a different way.
Yes. Genesis 15 is, in a certain sense, Abraham's salvation moment. Okay, and so he believes, trusts in the promises of God, and says he is reckoned as righteous, and he is justified in the sense of being reckoned righteous. 20 years later, that faith works its way out in a behavior that shows where his faith loyalties lie, and that is the section that is referred to by James in chapter 2, which we see is, therefore there's not a contradiction, there is not a conflict. Abraham's not getting saved twice, once in Genesis 15 and another time in Genesis 22. The justification means something different because the word has two senses to it, just like most words in every language have multiple meanings. Paul is talking about justification in the sense that we are reckoned righteous by faith alone. James is talking about the outworking of that faith by demonstrating or showing to be righteous, in that sense justified, by the works that we do. I think the way James puts it too, it's interesting. He says, you show me your faith without your works. Can that faith save you? That is, can that kind of faith that is just words with no behaviors behind it, is that a saving faith? That's right. And his answer, of course, is no. Yeah. Okay, good. So that's an example of just having to dig a little deeper to show that there's no real contradiction there. Finally, I think it's fair to say that there are some discrepancies that we find in the scriptures that, we're not going to be able to figure out. We're not going to be able to, this side of the resurrection, we're not going to be able to make sense out of. Look, we are 2,000 years at least removed in culture. We are moved geographically, thousands upon thousands of miles. We are removed in terms of language, and it's an ancient language that, some nuances may not ever be able to be recaptured this long away. And so we are not going to resolve these contradictions. However, keep in mind that there are a whole bunch of things that people listed as contradictions, and they have, as we'll show you, there's answers to all of these. So the list is getting smaller and smaller, and even some of them that seem to be irreconcilable, sometimes we find some information from the past. Somebody turns a spade and discovers some information archaeologically and think, oh, now that's what was going on there.
So just because we don't know what the possible reconciliation is, doesn't mean there isn't one.
That's right.
And so one example we talked about earlier was Judas. How did he die?
Yeah.
Right? You have Matthew 25 says he went and hanged himself. But then you read in the book of Acts that he fell headlong and got this kind of graphic picture of his bowels kind of gushing out. And how do you make sense of that?
Gross.
And there are, we just don't know what the answer is to that. People have said, well, maybe he hung himself, and then in the heat he fell, the branch broke, and then that's what, he fell on a rock and his bowels opened up or something. Or
maybe when he hung himself, the force, caused that to happen. But even the point there is we're not sure what happens, but one can imagine a scenario in which both of those could be true. And this takes us back to John A.T. Robinson.
Yeah.
If there's a potential way that both could be reconciled, well, then it's not a clear contradiction.
Yeah.
And therefore doesn't do the damage for us that some people suggest. So, okay, we have some other specific examples here. How about, let's start with this one this is an easy one, okay. It's a contradiction to say that God created something out of nothing.
To me, I'm struggling to find out what the contradiction is. Like, I would need to ask for more information on this question.
Where exactly is the contradiction, right?
So it's a contradiction. God created something from nothing. Taking our own advice, we want to be as charitable as possible.
Right.
So I'm imagining what their understanding is that God is creating something out of nothing. Treating nothing as if it's something
out of it, like you make bread out of flour. So God is creating something out of the stuff of nothing, and of course, nothing isn't a stuff, nothing
Yeah.
is no thing, it's universal negation, so that doesn't make any sense. And I
Yeah.
can see how, if that's what they meant, then I can see the concern, but also that isn't our view.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Our view is that it's creation ex nihilo. God creates not from something, but out of nothing. Absolutely no thing.
There is no thing, then something comes into existence.
That's right.
So that avoids the out of
Yeah.
language that might be equivocal
Sure.
or confusing.
Sure.
So we want to read them charitably and try to figure out what do they possibly mean. And, well, if this is what they mean, and I can't think of anything else that they would mean,
Sure.
then that represents maybe a little bit of a confusion about what we mean, and we're back to the concept I said earlier, first understand our view before you criticize it.
Yeah.
So, and again, sometimes the misunderstandings are somewhat innocent. You can see how people would be confused. But notice how we're able to reconcile that problem rather quickly.
Yeah.
There are also contradictions or alleged contradictions that have to do with.
Do you want to do the fig tree?
Pardon me?
Do you want to do the fig tree?
Oh yeah. Oh, I missed that. Yeah.
That
Let's
one
just take
comes
that
up
one. So
some-
there's. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So there's a classic contradiction or alleged contradiction that gets raised quite a bit. It's Jesus cursing the fig tree. Now, in Mark and Matthew, we have a description of the same event taking place. In Mark, we read that they're, let's go. Monday morning, the disciples, they head off from Bethany. They're going to go into Jerusalem. And on the way, they get a bit hungry. And so they see a fig tree. Let's go check it out for figs. They walk over. There's no figs. Jesus curses the fig tree. And then they go off to Jerusalem. And
He got up on the wrong side of the bed.
He did. He throws the tables. There's a whole mess there. And
It's
then
a rough day for him.
the disciples and Jesus head back to Bethany. Okay, now it's the next day, Tuesday morning. They're heading back into town. Well, what happens is they notice the fig tree on the way, and they see, look, it's withered up. And so here the cursing and the withering happens, it looks like over 2 days. When you read,
Or at least the discovery of the
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Now over in Matthew, it's actually the details are just kind of bang, 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 and this is what you get. Monday morning, leave Bethany. They're going to head in Jerusalem. They see the fig tree. They're hungry. Goes over. No figs. Curses it. Withers. They head into town.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And so here you have two accounts, and they seem to be at odds with each other. What I would argue is what we're getting here is, and this might land me in hot water, but you get kind of the guy version versus the girl version.
Well, I stole that line from you and said it first, so I'm
Sure.
the one who's going to get in trouble
Okay.
here. Okay.
So
yeah, guys
in Mark, you end up with, it's interesting, Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, and yet it has the most elaborate stories. The stories are told in the most space, the greater number of verses. And so here we have Mark explaining kind of in all the details. We'll call this the girl version of the story. When you go to Matthew is one of the longer books of the Gospels. And I think Luke actually in number of words is the longest, but Matthew is the longest in terms of chapters. But it has some of the shortest stories. And so here we have the guy version. It's just, okay, I know it happened over 2 days, but let me just explain this really quickly. And so he cursed it and it withered immediately. People have argued over that. Well, he said immediately. Well, fig trees normally don't wither
at all.
Right. in a 24 hours or a few minutes. No, that's not how it normally happens. So either way, it withered immediately. Mm-hmm. Here we have, it's sometimes called time compression. It's a summary of what took place. And again, if we can just let the authors of the New Testament write the way they want to write in the first century, and we see this isn't a contradiction. It's just two people telling the story from kind of a different perspective.
Another way that people think the Bible is contradictory is you seem to get two different pictures of salvation. And now we've already talked about this a little bit, but like in Jesus' teaching, you see Jesus saying, many will say, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? And he says, depart from me, I never knew you, you who work iniquity. Okay, now bad people are going to hell, okay?
That's right.
Other places say, well, it's not your works. You're not saved by works, but you're saved by grace. So what is it? Is it works or grace? And here I think this is where what we learn between Paul and James will serve us well, because we see this tension not just between Paul and James, but we see this in other passages of Scripture as well. And that is that there are two different types of people. There are people who live in wickedness and continue in their wickedness, and they will be judged according to their wickedness. This is clear in Revelation chapter 20. But then we see another group of people who are bad, but who beat their breast like Jesus' tax gatherer and says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, and they go away justified. Now, those are people whose lives end up getting changed. They don't continue living in the same immorality or patterns of immorality that they used to. Are they still sinners? Yeah, every single day. And this is clear because nobody keeps the two greatest commandments ever, So we are all still sinners and we are in need of God's grace. But there is a difference between being continuing in rebellion and walking with Christ and in the Spirit, putting to death the deeds of the flesh. And this is exactly the point that James is making in James chapter 2. And I think that notion, that concept, will help us to reconcile a lot of the apparent conflicting verses that talk about law versus grace.
Sure.
Let's take a jump here and talk about, let's see, we had a bunch of quick ones here. What was the color of Jesus' robe? Was it scarlet or was it purple? Matthew says scarlet, Mark says purple, John says purple. What say you?
Well, and this is interesting because I was explaining to you earlier that I did an event last week. It was a week-long Christian camp, and I actually called one of the students up on stage, and I said, hey, you, front row, green shirt, come on up. Comes up to the front, standing next to me, and he says, you think this shirt is green? And I guess all the girls yelled, it's aqua, or something like that. Or it looked green to me. And so here's an example, I think, of where I guess it depends on your perspective of color.
Sure.
And if you took scarlet, a deep scarlet, and put it next to a deep purple to me, I don't think I would be able to tell the difference. Yeah. And so this is charity.
For each, yeah.
This is charity. These are fishermen, not fashion designers, right?
Right.
And so let's be charitable.
Yeah. So to one it looked scarletish, another one it looked purplish.
And maybe they had debate when they were.
And really, this is the problem.
I know.
This is the problem. Okay. So what we're showing is there's a way to charitably reconcile that apparent contradiction. So it's not really contradiction. What about this? Did Jesus answer his accusers? Matthew 27. I think he's before the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
He speaks nothing. He does not answer his accusers. He doesn't speak in his defense. But when he's in John 18 before he's Pilate, then he does have a bit of a conversation there.
That's right. And so here, again, it depends what you mean by accusers. He doesn't speak to his accusers, which are the Pharisees, which are the chief priests. And then he does speak to Pilate. So I guess you might want to ask a few questions there. Yeah.
Pilate wasn't an accuser. Pilate was... There was nothing that Jesus did wrong according to Pilate.
That's right.
This was part of his complaint, He said, you crucify this guy. Come on, what did he do wrong? I find no wrong in him. And of course, there are political reasons why he went ahead to crucify him. But this is just a carefuler look at the texts, and you see that there are two different kinds of things going on. With regards to his actual accusers, the Sanhedrin, he gives no response. And then when he's brought before the man who is legally responsible for authorizing his execution, who is not an accuser, he does have a conversation, but it is actually rather minimal, and he makes no defense for himself. He just talks a bit, because Pilate says to him, don't you realize I have the authority to let you go or put you to death? Yeah. Why won't you defend yourself? So I see no contradiction there at all in those passages. Okay, here's another one. These come across our desks basically, but these strike us as rather simple to resolve.
Some
And I
of them,
suspect most of you who look at these passages yourself will see the resolutions here. This one is who carried the cross. In the synoptics, we see Simon carrying the cross.
Yeah.
In Jesus, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is carrying the cross. Doesn't mention Simon apparently.
Yeah. And so in John, I think the text actually says he was carrying it out of the city. And then in the Synoptic Gospels, you have Simon taking over. And to me,
at one point,
where's the contradiction?
Where is the contradiction? Right.
Right?
So both are true. Jesus carried his cross, and Simon did also at one point in time. Yeah. So, this is another kind of a make-me-up.
Yeah.
There's no real problem here, but somebody wants to fuss about this, and it turns out that both are true.
Yeah.
So you have an example of selective reporting.
Yeah.
John simply chose not to mention Simon.
Yeah.
How is that a contradiction? Okay, both are true. There is no contradiction. Okay, here's a great one. Because this trades on another kind of confusion that we find when people read the Bible. How long was Jesus in the tomb? Okay, 3 days and 3 nights, 3 days and 3 nights, 3 days. We see that over and over, and then you read the text and it says, crucified on Friday, risen Sunday morning. Wait a minute. That's hardly even 2 days.
Now, this particular challenge, unlike some of the others, I mean, you can't fault the person necessarily because they might not understand the culture that this is written in.
Exactly right.
And when you understand the culture this is written in, you know that this 3 days and 3 nights would have been a Hebrew idiom. Right. This is a kind of a figure of speech. For those people, for the Jews, part of a day was considered the day. And so when you have crucified in the morning Friday and then raised on Sunday, they would consider that over 3 days.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Any part of a day was a day and a night. And it was absolutely natural and non-contradictory and non-controversial for them to make this reference of 3 days and 3 nights, even though, strictly speaking, by the clocks, it would not include mornings and evenings entirely in each of those days. So this just an idiom of the culture here. Now, here's a question. What actually was written above the cross on the titulus identifying Jesus' crime against Caesar?
I think verbatim, we can't say for certain. You get actually in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John 4 different descriptions of what was written there. And so you got something like Matthew, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. Mark, the King of the Jews. Luke, this is the King of the Jews. And then finally in John, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now, there's actually a commonality between all these, King of the Jews.
Right.
But there's some differences. Now, some have harmonized these, brought them all together and said, this is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews.
The King of the Jews.
Yeah, the King. You could do all that. You could put all those words together.
And it's certainly possible.
It's certainly possible. But it could just be these guys were paraphrasing.
That's right.
In John, it tells us that the what was inscribed there was actually in 3 different languages.
Yeah.
So maybe Latin, Greek, Hebrew. Maybe these were different inscriptions, and so one said something about Jesus being from Nazareth, and so they included that part. I mean, we just don't know.
Yeah.
But why not give the biblical authors a little bit of leniency here?
Right.
Again, they're not verbatim reporting. They're just paraphrasing something that was on there.
Yeah, that's reading charitably and being willing to at least to imagine a way of understanding this in which there's no contradiction. And this isn't like, please don't be mean to us, always think best of us. This is a standard way we approach readers in general. Asking us to read charitably is not asking to do special favors for us so it doesn't look like a contradiction. This is a standard way. Now, here is something that, I just noticed recently, as it turns out. I didn't mention this to you, but on the cross, Jesus encounters there on Calvary 2 different men that are crucified on either side of him. They are both thieves, okay? Now, we know famously about the one thief who repents, and today you will be with me in paradise. So this is well known. But I just noticed as I'm reading one of the accounts, it says in one of the accounts that both thieves were railing against Jesus and kind of mocking him from the cross.
Yeah.
Now, gosh, which one is right? There's a contradiction for you.
Yeah, and to me, again, this just seems like they can both be true. You can have both railing against Jesus when they're first on the cross in that first period of time. And then at the end, they've been up there. This thief is watching what's happening. He's noticed that they're railing against Jesus. They're spitting on him, mocking him, and all the rest. And yet, he doesn't revile in return.
Right.
He sees something different.
Right.
And as a result, he repents.
My first reaction when I saw that was that very reaction. I didn't think, oh my gosh, how am I going to reconcile this contradiction? What I thought was, how magnificent. This one that we know about repenting started out railing against Jesus, and something about watching Jesus on the cross melted his heart.
Yeah.
So that he is, figuratively speaking, beating his own breast. Please remember me when you come in your kingdom. And I thought I was quite touched by that, but some read it as a contradiction. Now we just have a few minutes left, like 3 or 4 minutes here, and we can't move forward without saying something about the resurrection account, because this is where all kinds of alleged contradictions have popped up. So can we say a couple of things about when did they visit the tomb, and where was the stone, and who was there, and etc.?
Sure. So one of the things that comes up all the time, especially with Bart Ehrman, famous New Testament textual critic, he says, how many women went to the tomb? Was it one, like John? Was it? And then each gospel gives a different number. And again, there's a technique that some scholars have identified as what they call spotlighting. That is, the gospel writer is highlighting one particular person. Like imagine a spotlight on a stage.
Right.
There might be other actors on the stage, but only one is under the spotlight. So here we have in John, it's Mary Magdalene. And she's the one at the tomb. And it seems like maybe she's alone. Well, until you read the next verse that says she runs back to tell Peter and their disciples, and she says, we don't know where they've taken him. Who's the we, Mary?
Yeah.
Right? And so here we go. There's some women. You go to Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and another Mary. It doesn't say that's the only two, just identifies those two. You read Luke, and there's a whole group of women. It names 3, and then says, and the other women with them. And so here you have an example of, it's not just the one person and only that one person, or only those 2 people. It's just the author spotlighting those individuals.
In Mark chapter 5, you have the Gadarene demoniac, and in one account they have 2 demoniacs, another one. There's a spotlight on just the one. It's not a contradiction, just a spotlighting. What about when did they visit the tomb? I'm just kidding. Was it toward dawn, Matthew, after sunrise, Mark, at early dawn, Luke, still dark, John? I'll tell you what I thought of this objection. I thought of going fishing in the morning. I've taken my boat out. I left the house at dark 30. And then as the sun's coming up, I'm on the water trying to catch the early bite. Now, if somebody asks me, when did you go fishing in the morning? I could say at sunrise, and that would have been accurate. I could say, man, I left when it was still dark. I could say the light was just breaking as I'm driving towards the lake. I mean, given the fact that the journey takes time, all those things could be happening at the same time. And I don't see why, again, on a charitable reading, we can't see that to be the case with these alleged contradictions here. There's a lot more that we could deal with, and we just don't have time, okay? But I hope that what Tim and I have done, and again, I want to commend his article to you that you can find on str.org. And how would they find it? Is there a title?
Just type in, is the Bible full of contradictions?
There you go. And you'll get more detail on this and more of the rationale. But I want to re-emphasize some of the things I said up at the beginning. There is an importance of reading an author charitably. This is a standard procedure in any kind of engagement. Anything you read, that's the appropriate way. It's important for skeptics to understand our view, or else they're going to see contradictions where they're not contradictions. There are some passages that, seem hard to reconcile until you dig a lot deeper. And then deeper understanding theologically, historically, things kind of settle out and they become clear. And there's also going to be some discrepancies. Let's face it, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to make sense of it. But I will tell you this, on the list of those kinds of discrepancies over the years, the number has gotten lower and lower. So we're on a good trajectory here. We can't demand that we cover every single possible problem, okay? Final thought, and that is, what does this all add up to anyway? Even if somebody were to say, yes, there is a contradiction, and yes, they could prove that was the case, what ramifications does that have for the Christian account of reality, for the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, for the existence of God, for our salvation? It has no ramifications on it whatsoever. That is, it may turn out that there are flaws. I'm not suggesting this is the case, but even if we accepted, or somebody else accepted that there were some flaws in certain passages, it doesn't follow from that that the accountings of the big things that really matter are flawed. Our libraries are filled with books that are flawed, yet we rely on them every day to tell us truth about important things about life. Tim, thanks so much for spending some time with us. And
it's always good spending time with you.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you for spending time with us, too. Hope this was helpful.